Hello, I am Adolf Hitler, and I would like to share my story with you. I was born on April 20th, 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a town in the Austro-Hungarian Empire nestled close to the German border. My father, Alois, once a Schickelgruber but a Hitler since 1877, was a stern and commanding custom civil servant. My mother, Clara, on the other hand, was a beacon of kindness and gentleness. Initially a servant to our family, Clara married my father in 1885 after the death of his second wife, becoming his third. Together, they brought 6 children into the world, though only my sister Paula and I lived past childhood. My mother, perhaps traumatized by the frequent loss of her children, enveloped me in a protective and affectionate embrace, especially after witnessing my father's harsh punishments. Her warmth forged a profound love within me, and I cherished her image close to my heart until my final days. The years 1900 and 1903 brought further sorrow to our family with the deaths of my younger brother Edmund and my father, respectively. The loss destabilized me, reflecting in my plummeting school performance and an emerging solemnity. Despite navigating through several schools, maintaining few friendships, and often showing insolence towards my teachers, I managed to pass my exams without a clear vision for my future. In the comfort of my mother's home, I spent my post-school days drawing, painting, and immersing myself in the local opera, harboring no apparent desire to carve my own path in the world. Then, at 18, with my mother battling breast cancer and I without ever having worked, I sought new horizons in Vienna, aspiring to join the Vienna School of Fine Arts. My dreams crumbled when they rejected me, a setback I had never envisioned. In 1907, tragedy struck again with the loss of my dearly beloved mother to breast cancer. Her death plunged me into an abyss of despair, a grief so overwhelming that even our family doctor remarked upon its intensity. In the aftermath of my mother's funeral, I found myself back in Vienna. My days were not consumed by conventional employment, but rather were filled with reading, painting, and indulging in the operas of Richard Wagner. In 1908, I sought entry to the Academy of Fine Arts, yet was rejected without even the opportunity to prove myself through an entrance exam. This rejection led me to move to a different part of the Austrian capital. By 1909, doubt, resentment, and depression shrouded my existence. I lived the life of a tramp, spending nights in shelters and days wandering Vienna, visiting soup kitchens, until I began selling my paintings as postcards to eke out a living. Interestingly, many of my paintings were purchased by Jewish businessmen with whom I shared amicable relations at the time. Although my later assertions might suggest otherwise, there is no credible evidence to validate that my anti-Jewish and anti-Bolshevik sentiments were formed during this period. From a young age, I was enamored with Germanic culture, and living in Vienna, a city bustling with diverse ethnic groups and nationalities from all parts of the Austrian Empire, may have shaped my views on non-German speaking individuals. My resentment also extended to the Austrian government for their policies of integrating foreigners, whom I perceived to be treated better than the native citizens. My disdain for my homeland grew, and upon receiving my share of my father's inheritance at 24 and wishing to evade military service, I left Vienna for Munich in 1913, continuing to sell my painted postcards. When the First World War broke out, I, though a foreigner, was allowed to enlist in the German army. Serving as a dispatch runner, I faced numerous battles such as the Somme, Arras, and Passchendaele, primarily against the British. My bravery was recognized, earning me the Iron Cross, second class, and subsequently first class, the latter nominated by my Jewish commanding officer. In August 1918, I experienced a frightening ordeal. A mustard gas attack on the battlefield blinded me temporarily. Lying in a hospital bed, I spent the remaining months of World War I recovering from this debilitating condition. Before my incapacitation, I had perceived Germany to be on the brink of victory, so imagine my disbelief when, weakened by famine, exhaustion, and internal strife, our nation surrendered merely 3 months later. I couldn't accept this defeat at face value. I sought reasons, culprits. It was too perplexing to believe that the mighty German Empire could simply crumble in a fair fight. My mind wandered to those within our borders whom I thought had weakened our strength from the inside. Jews, communists, radical elements that in my belief had undermined our war effort. The idea was not entirely mine. The myth that an international conspiracy, especially involving Jews, was behind Germany's defeat had been circulating, partially fueled by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. Ironically, it was the German High Command that had facilitated Vladimir Lenin's return to Russia, contributing to the revolution. But it was easier, more comforting to blame the enemy within than to admit that we might have been fairly defeated. My life took a turn in 1919 when Munich and Bavaria became engulfed in communist agitation, culminating in the Bavarian Revolution in April. The Soviet Republic was established, albeit briefly, before it was overthrown. During this chaotic time, I was serving in the German army, initially as a guard at a prisoner of war camp and after its disbandment at a train station in Munich. Interestingly, records from that time named me as my company's liaison with the ruling communist regime after the Soviet Republic of Bavaria was proclaimed. After the fall of the Soviet regime in Bavaria, I remained in the German army, albeit in a much diminished capacity, but was assigned to a counter-revolutionary intelligence unit. My task was to gather information on various radical political groups in the area, an assignment that further plunged me into the depths of political intrigue and belief in internal enemies. In the wake of the devastation left by World War I found myself immersing in the political turmoil brewing in Bavaria. Upon being assigned to Munich University, I was enveloped by an army-funded course where German history, the political climate, and public speaking skills were fervently imparted upon us. This course, designed to counteract the far-left revolutionary movements in the region, unknowingly molded my right-wing political stance. It was in this turbulent era where hostility towards the far left pulsated through Bavaria that I saw an opportunity to voice my views, to find an audience that would resonate with my thoughts, and thus to ignite my political journey. One day, while engrossed in a heated debate with a colleague, my superiors noticed something in me, a spark, perhaps, ignited by my vehement debating skills. Subsequently, I found myself propelled to a position where I was tasked with delivering lectures to our troops, those who were suspected of harboring Marxist sympathies. Around this time, my anti-Semitic views began to intertwine with my staunch anti-communist sentiments, forming a world view that was distinctly nationalistic and far-right. I was vehemently opposed to what I perceived as malignant external influences, the Jews, the Marxists, and the impositions of the Versailles Treaty, all of which I believed had insidiously undermined Germany. September 12th, 1919, a pivotal moment in my journey. I attended a meeting of the diminutive and seemingly innocuous German Workers' Party. Whether it was my own initiative or an order from my army superiors, I joined the movement as member 555. My ascent within the party was swift, my speeches in Munich's beer halls resonating with a populace disenchanted and beleaguered. Contrary to what many believe, my political views were not set in stone at this juncture. Observing my audience, gauging their reactions, I began to emphasize certain viewpoints and neglect others, riding the existing wave of public opinion on anti-Semitism and amplifying it to garner notoriety and power. In 1921, a crucial decision lay before the National Socialist German Workers' Party, now colloquially known as the Nazi Party. A motion to merge with the German Socialist Party threatened my influence within the party. In a high-stakes gamble, I resigned, causing a stir given the pivotal role I had begun to play. My gamble paid off. The merger was cancelled by Drexler, and upon my return, I laid down an ultimatum. I would rejoin only if I were made party chairman. The subsequent vote was overwhelmingly in my favor, cementing my position and setting me on a path that would indelibly mark history. With absolute power in my grasp, I, now known as the Führer, intensified my speeches and public appearances, gaining recognition not only within Bavaria, but far beyond. In 1923, I sought the alliance of Erich Ludendorff, the former head of Germany's armed forces and one who had previously perpetuated the myth of the enemy within. I persuaded him to join me in a coup to overthrow the Bavarian government. On November 8th, 1923, my followers and I stormed into a public meeting led by Gustav von Kahr, the head of the Bavarian government, proclaiming the dawn of a revolution. The following day, despite the support of comrades like Rudolf Hess, Hermann Göring, Ernst Röhm, and Heinrich Himmler, our attempt to seize the Bavarian War Ministry faltered. Troops opened fire, chaos ensued, and we fled. My actions led to my arrest, and in February 1924, I stood trial for high treason. Although sentenced to 5 years in Landsberg prison, I utilized my time wisely. Within those confining walls, I penned Mein Kampf, an explosive mix of autobiography and political doctrine, detailing my vision for a racially pure Germany and expressing my vehement opposition to Marxism. By December 20th, 1924, I found myself pardoned and free. I immediately resumed leadership of the Nazi Party. However, with the German economy flourishing, I realized that violent attempts to seize power were futile. My focus shifted towards gaining control through political and peaceful avenues. Despite this, between 1924 and 1928, my popularity waned, culminating in a disheartening 1928 election where I secured merely 800,000 votes, a stark contrast to the nearly 2 million votes 4 years prior. It seemed that obscurity and failure were inevitable. However, fate had other plans. The Wall Street crash in October 1929 sent ripples throughout the global economy. Germany, already burdened by massive debts, witnessed soaring inflation, skyrocketing unemployment, and pervasive food shortages. The despair that gripped the nation created the perfect environment for my ideals to once again gain traction amongst the populace. In those desolate times, I found my calling and my Nazi party thrived, fueled by the desperation that enveloped Germany. The omnipresent despair was our ammunition, the very tool that propelled us into the limelight. As the desperation of the population grew, I intensified my campaigning, harnessing modern technologies like aircraft, enabling me to make speeches in various cities in a single day during our frequent national elections. My promises of bread and work seemed like divine intervention to the suffering German people, causing our vote share to surge. In the midst of this crisis, and with increasingly regular elections, the Reichstag was in deadlock. No political party held majority or overall control. This prompted leading politicians to implore the head of state, Paul von Hindenburg, to appoint me as Chancellor. After 2 more elections without a clear victor, on January 30th, 1933, I was appointed Chancellor of Germany. I quickly sought to solidify my grip on the nation, requesting Hindenburg to dissolve Parliament for fresh elections in March. But in February of 1933, the Reichstag, our parliament building, was engulfed in flames. I persuaded Hindenburg to enact the Reichstag fire decree, suspending basic civil rights and enabling detention without trial. Though we, the Nazis, were quick to pin the blame on the far left and practically dismantled the German Communist Party in the ensuing months, it was I who gained the most from the calamity. In our next meeting at the Kroll Opera House, the Reichstag granted me de facto control over Germany through an enabling act, which allowed me to pass laws without Parliament's consent for 4 years. Through this act, the Reichstag unwittingly sealed its own fate. essentially making me the dictator of Germany and extinguishing the flame of German democracy. In the months that followed, all political opposition was ruthlessly suppressed. Political parties were dissolved, and potential threats were incarcerated, either in prisons or in the concentration camps that began to emerge throughout Germany. I then embarked on an ambitious plan to reconstruct and revitalize the country's economy, canceling austerity and initiating a colossal public works program through loans, which drastically reduced the country's unemployment figures. In the early 1930s, I faced but two barriers to absolute power in Germany. One was President Hindenburg, technically my superior, and the other, the Army High Command, growing restless over Ernst Röhm and his expansive essay, The Brown Shirts. Initially, the SA was the National Socialist Party's muscle against communists in the 1920s. But their numbers had swollen into millions, dwarfing the German army, and their brutality drew increasing complaints. Hindenburg demanded I control the SA and Röhm, who had become threats to the army, the government, and even to myself. So, with my approval, plans were formulated to suppress the SA permanently. This operation, codenamed Hummingbird, took place from June 30th to July 2nd, 1934, spearheaded by Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, and Reinhard Heydrich. Arrests rippled through the nation, with dozens of political enemies, including SA leaders, arrested and executed without trial. Röhm and other political adversaries like Ritter von Kahr of the Bavarian government met brutal ends. This operation, later known as the Night of the Long Knives, allowed me to extinguish opposition within and outside the Nazi Party and to appease both Hindenburg and the Army High Command. When Hindenburg passed away on August 2nd, 1934, I seized the opportunity to establish myself as head of state, compelling the German army to pledge allegiance directly to me. In little over a year of being Chancellor, I held unparalleled control over every aspect of German life, heralding the dawn of the Third Reich. Investments surged into Germany's infrastructure, industry, and a rapidly rearming military over the next 4 years, absorbing hundreds of thousands from the SA. Our arsenal expanded with new aircraft, tanks, and weaponry. Meanwhile, France and Britain began noticing the escalating threat, despite many admiring our economic revival. As I bolstered Germany, international murmurs about the potential dangers grew. But many were reluctant to envision another European war, and were uncertain of my future intentions. So the world watched, hoped, and hesitated, even as warning signs intensified and cries for France and Britain to intervene before it was too late amplified. I turned my gaze towards my birthland Austria, feeling the pulsating unity calls from the nationalist supporters of my Nazi party across both German and Austrian borders. Despite the Austrian government's resistance, I gave them an ultimatum on March 11th. Allow those who wish to cross into Germany to do so freely. My patience, however, was tried by their constant stalling. Thus, on the morning of March 12th, 1938, I ordered the Wehrmacht to march into Austria. Thereafter, I embarked on a triumphant tour, passing through my hometown of Braunau and proceeding towards Vienna, where throngs of people cheered me on. My initial strategic gamble had indeed paid off. The Western powers did not intervene in my annexation of Austria. Emboldened, I turned my sights towards Czechoslovakia, demanding the Sudetenland, home to many German-speaking people, be placed under German control. Despite initial resistance from the British and French, the Munich conference culminated in an agreement allowing Germany to annex the Sudetenland, provided I staked no further territorial claims in Europe. I agreed, but on September 29th, 1938, after acquiring the territory, my dissatisfaction led me to order the Wehrmacht to invade the rest of Czechoslovakia the following spring, violating the Munich agreement with France and Britain. My insatiable desire for more territory, especially the German land of West Prussia, separated from East Prussia and handed to Poland after World War I, along with my assertion that Germany needed more Lebensraum, living space, in Eastern Europe, directed my focus towards Poland. But first, To avoid conflict with the Soviet Union, on August 23, 1939, we signed a non-aggression pact, agreeing to divide Poland between us. This precarious move propelled Europe towards the brink of war and subsequently led Britain and Poland to forge the Anglo-Polish alliance 2 days post the German-Soviet agreement, where Britain vowed to uphold Polish independence. In the early dawn of September 1st, 1939, my forces surged across the Polish border. I'd gambled believing Britain wouldn't plunge back into another European war. Yet just 2 days later, to my astonishment, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Poland, despite their courageous resistance, was quickly overwhelmed by our mighty tanks, mechanized infantry, and the fierce Luftwaffe under Hermann Göring. Then, on the 17th of September, the Soviet Union, our temporary ally, marched into eastern Poland, splitting the country in two. The subsequent period, later dubbed the Phony War, saw Britain and France holding back, not launching an attack. And I seized this opportunity to fortify our western border. And after witnessing the fall of Denmark and Norway in 1940's spring, I set my sights on Holland, Belgium, and eventually France itself. On May 10th, 1940, our Army Group B in the north surged through the Low Countries of Holland and Belgium. This lured the British and French armies to the north, while our main force in the heavily forested Ardennes, deemed impassable by the Allied leadership, sliced through the inadequately defended French lines, racing towards the Channel ports and leaving Paris vulnerable. This stratagem sent shivers of panic through the Allies. After their sporadic counterattacks crumbled, the British, surrounded, withdrew from France in what became renowned as the Dunkirk evacuation. With Britain momentarily out of the picture, Paris was ours. Under immense pressure, the French declared their beloved city open, and the Wehrmacht marched in on June 14th, 1940. 8 days later, on the 22nd of June, French delegates under the new leadership of Marshal Pétain met with us at Compiègne. It was in the very same railway carriage where, back in 1918, the Germans had conceded to the Allies. A poetic moment of revenge. My tour of Paris on June 24th was a singular occasion, exploring the city by motorcade, paying respects at Napoleon's tomb, and marveling at the majesty of the Eiffel Tower. It was a moment of triumph in a city that had symbolized an enduring adversary. In mere weeks, I had orchestrated the defeat of France and struck a devastating blow against Britain. I was hailed as the master of Europe, a national hero, wiping away the disgrace and defeat lingering from the First World War and exacting revenge on those who had wronged Germany. Britain, however, under its new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, resiliently refused to negotiate peace. Churchill, resolute in his defiance against me, chose to prolong the struggle to an unforgiving end. My trusted Hermann Göring assured me that the Luftwaffe was sufficiently powerful to overpower the British Royal Air Force and pave the way for an invasion across the Channel. Without reason to doubt him, I sanctioned the aerial assault, commencing on July 10th, 1940, with extensive air raids on southern English targets, including their airfields and radar installations. The ensuing air battles resulted in substantial losses on both sides. A pivotal moment came on August 2nd, when the RAF, aiming for Berlin's industrial zones, mistakenly dropped bombs on residential areas due to obstructive heavy cloud cover. Enraged by this, I ordered Göring to retaliate, directing our attacks on London. This inadvertently relieved pressure on the critically damaged airfields in southern England, allowing the RAF precious time to rebuild its forces. Despite our sustained bombardments on civilian targets, by October 1940, I acknowledged that the British defences remained too formidable to permit a successful invasion. I thus abandoned Operation Sea Lion, diverting my gaze eastward towards Russia. My disdain for Bolshevism was long-standing, and I perceived the Soviet Union as a fragile, backward state, poised for downfall. I instructed the German High Command to devise plans for a comprehensive invasion, which was dubbed Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval Teutonic king who battled the Slavs. Barbarossa, destined to become the most extensive ground invasion in human history, mobilized nearly 3 million German troops, distributed among 3 colossal army groups. The strongest army group center aimed its forces through the heart of the Soviet Union towards Moscow. Army Group North sought to capture Leningrad on the Baltic coast and then swing south to aid the push on Moscow, while Army Group South was charged with overtaking Ukraine and its capital, Kiev. In the early hours of June 22nd, 1941, I unleashed the might of the German army upon the unsuspecting Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, as it was known, initially unfolded like a well-scripted drama, with millions of Russian soldiers either perishing or being ensnared in our strategic encirclements. The Soviet Union tottered on the brink of collapse, and Joseph Stalin, shocked and dismayed, secluded himself, paralyzing the Red Army's command structure for critical weeks. As we marched forward, my army began to encounter unexpected resistance. The Soviet troops, astonishing in their resilience and bravery, seemed to grow more determined with every step we took into their homeland. The vastness of Russia, its numbingly cold winters, and its vast numbers of tanks and infantry began to weigh heavily on my mind. The autumn rains of 1941 turned the Russian landscape into a quagmire, halting our advance. We could proceed only when the frigid winter froze the muddy earth solid. My forces, designed for swift and decisive warfare and ill-prepared for winter combat, found themselves bogged down, freezing in the bitter cold. Our petrol-based vehicles faltered in the chilling temperatures, whereas the Soviets' diesel machines persevered. Despite these hardships, the German army nearly captured Moscow in December 1941, but ultimately we were forced to dig in for the winter, providing the Soviets with precious time to regroup and resupply. During this time, my personal physician, Dr. Theodore Morel, began administering to me a dangerous cocktail of drugs, including methamphetamine and potent sedatives to manage my health issues. This undoubtedly clouded my judgment, impacting my strategic decisions on the Eastern Front in the ensuing years. As the war progressed, I found myself increasingly enveloped in the strategic decisions of my armies, often to their detriment. Unlike Stalin, who learned to delegate military decisions to his generals, I progressively usurped control from my military leaders, resulting in catastrophic consequences for the Wehrmacht. Meanwhile, in early 1942, pivotal and dark decisions were being made in my name. SS leaders convened at Wannsee, near Berlin, where, under the leadership of Reinhard Heydrich, they devised what was chillingly referred to as the final solution to the Jewish question. Consequently, millions of Jews, along with gypsies and homosexuals, were horrifically transported across Europe to death camps, where they were systematically exterminated. In these trying times, our great German nation faced unprecedented challenges, both economically and militarily. A monumental strain bore down upon our economy as the establishment and maintenance of camps, an essential element of our final solution, consumed thousands of troops and millions of Reichsmarks. Despite the severe depletion of our limited resources, my comrades, Himmler, Heydrich, and I were unyielding in our resolve to exterminate the Jewish people, even amidst the desperate need for resources on our embattled fronts. In the spring of 1942, we gallantly resumed our eastern offensive against the Soviets. However, a new challenge arose when Japan, our ally, attacked the United States' Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, compelling us to declare war on the United States. This unleashed America's vast industrial potential against us, and we found ourselves embroiled in conflict on 4 fronts: against Russia, amidst the bombing campaigns against Britain, striving to disrupt Allied shipping in the North Atlantic, and in North Africa, where we sought to counterbalance the British dominance after Mussolini's failed Egyptian campaign. Our industry stretch it to its very limits by the escalation of the final solution, and these multifaceted military endeavors teetered on the brink of exhaustion. As we pressed further into Russia in 1942, our supply lines stretched thin, and we faced a burgeoning resistance of Russian troops and tanks. Although Leningrad lay besieged by our Army Group North, the attempts of Army Group Center to conquer Moscow met with failure and subsequent Soviet counterattacks, directing our gaze southward towards the vital oil fields of the Baku region in Crimea. We sought a decisive blow. I ordered the capture of Stalingrad, a strategic industrial city on the River Volga, not only weakening our drive into Crimea, but also sparking one of history's most ferocious battles over the ensuing months. Stalingrad transformed into a cauldron of death as both sides funneled innumerable troops into the maelstrom. Despite our numerical inferiority, we fought valiantly until the Soviets, seizing an opportune moment in November 1942, executed a counterattack that severed our forces to the north and south of the city. Isolated within Stalingrad, our army relied on the Luftwaffe for air-dropped supplies. Yet the Russians inexorably tightened their stranglehold. Attempts to breach through to the city failed, and in February 1943, our 6th Army was compelled to surrender, costing us nearly 750,000 troops in this single devastating battle. The tide turned irrevocably against us, against Germany, and against me, particularly on the Eastern Front. From that moment forward, it was a relentless tale of defeat and withdrawal, punctuated by desperate counterattacks like the one at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. It was one of the largest tank battles in history, and it cost us dearly, hundreds of thousands of troops, and it was my last serious offensive against the Soviet Union. Failure there meant that the fate of Germany and my fate were almost sealed. Meanwhile, by 1943, the Americans and the British had claimed North Africa and were invading Sicily. I could feel the clock ticking, and my desperation grew, often resulting in irrational decisions, ordering my troops to fight to the death and forbidding withdrawal. Then came the 6th of June 1944, D-Day. I was asleep as the invasion commenced, and orders were not issued to the front around Normandy until later, effectively tipping victory into Allied hands. Soon after, Paris fell, and the German army began to crumble under the pressure, with the Third Reich's industrial centers and cities being flattened by relentless Allied bombing. Despite being the head of the armed forces since December 1941 and making all major strategic decisions myself, I began to lose faith in my generals, sacking one after another, even though my own experience and knowledge were limited. The attempts on my life, including the bomb attack by Klaus von Stauffenberg at my eastern headquarters, the Wolf's Lair on the 20th of July 1944, only deepened my paranoia and mistrust, damaging my already fragile health. By spring of 1945, as Berlin was surrounded, and I, now a quivering wreck showing early symptoms of Parkinson's disease or possibly drug withdrawal, chose to marry my long-term mistress, Eva Braun, on the 29th of April 1945, a woman who had stood by me since the mid-1930s, despite being 23 years my junior. Shortly after 1 p.m. on April 30th, 1945, I found myself enveloped by the dim confines of my private chambers within the Führerbunker, located beneath the Reichschancellery Gardens in Berlin. A moment of silence ensued and a gunshot echoed through the chamber. I had chosen to end my life, directing a pistol towards my right temple while simultaneously succumbing to the bitter poison from a cyanide capsule. Beside me, Eva Braun, slumped on the sofa, also embraced the bitter end through cyanide. My life, spanning 56 years, witnessed an astonishing, albeit devastating trajectory. Once a mere tramp, I rose to become the most powerful man on earth by 1940, only to witness the very nation I adored and everything I had strived for crumble before my eyes. My early life was marred by aimlessness, and it was only through a series of chance happenings that I was thrust into the limelight. Once there, I exploited the prejudices and fears of the German people to grasp power and orchestrate a war, despite lacking the resources, intellect, and talent to secure victory. I'm often pointed to as the catalyst for the Second World War and the orchestrator of the Holocaust, leading to the unimaginable suffering and death of upwards of 55 million innocent souls. The brave soldiers and resistance members from various nations who stood against my ideas and actions deserve an unpayable debt of gratitude from history.